Hello, Nick Tockert here with the Historical Fencing Guild. True to my word, it is January 31st, 2018, and I am filming the first in my series of educational videos pertaining to my book, The Simple Sword. The Simple Sword is a manual meant to bridge the gap between someone who's never held a sword and between them and someone who's reading, period manuals, classical manuals, and other instructions. It's sort of a primer. It's also geared to those who will eventually have adaptive needs, such as being out of shape or having a physical disability. As all martial arts are very physical, please confer with your medical professional before you engage in anything, because I don't want you hurt. Understand also that I am showing you martial techniques, weapons-based techniques. They are inherently dangerous. And though practice should be done safely and with respect, accidents can happen. So know what you're getting into before you start this. Now, before we get into how one sword fights, what my book has to say about that, first we need to skip the introduction, in that by now hopefully you know me. If not, I'll introduce myself. My name is Nicholas Anthony Tockert II. I am, of course, the author of The Simple Sword. I have been fencing for over 20 years. I have been instructing for over 15. My specialty early on, I was involved in a medieval recreation group, has been finding the students who don't think they can do it and helping them to find systems and ways to move forward. Now, if you are able-bodied, the system will work for you. It is a very simple, easy-to-learn system. However, if you find yourself having difficulty, the system may also work for you. As with anything, it's how much you put into it. Now, in this video, I'm simply going to cover the sword as I define it, the parts of the sword, and a bit on selecting a sword that fits your personal needs and your body. For the purpose of this video, I will be using this. This is a side sword trainer, and it is made by Purple Heart Armory. I custom designed it. It is a modification of their Venetian infantry trainer, and I picked the sword not only because it is a design I personally use. This is my personal fighting blade when I am sparring. It is also because it will show up very well on camera. As you can see, a sword has a blade and a handle. Okay? All these parts I refer to as riggings because on an actual sword, not mass-produced like this, you can thread the pommel on and change these. Since this is a two-piece unit, the guard being the only real separate, and the retainers 3. It's a little different, but again, I'm working to make it easy for you as a viewer. We'll start with the blade. Everyone is familiar with a sword blade. This is representative of a double-edged sword, so the bottom and top, as I'm holding it, would be sharp, as well as the tip brought to a point. For safety reasons, all of this is rounded, obviously. However, the bottom edge of a sword is the true edge. You can tell the true edge because when you clench a sword in your hand, your knuckles align with the true edge. Okay? Now, if you hold it flat in some styles, it gets a little dicier. But in a traditional grip, the true edge is the edge you would strike down with. On single-bladed swords, that is the only sharp edge. This is considered a double-bladed sword, so both edges will be considered sharp. This is the false edge. Now, the false edge isn't always sharp. For my representation and how we fight with it, we assume it is. In many curved swords and later period swords, this part might not be that sharp. But, moving on. The blade is broken down into many parts along its length. For my system, there are 3 you should know and 2 you really will use. If you break the blade into thirds, 1, 2, 3, the blade portion closest to your hand is called the forte. That means strong, and that is referring to leverage. Remember, this is a roughly 3-foot long sharpened metal stick. That means all the laws of physics apply. So, if I'm gripping here, and someone tries to push the sword out of my hand, it's very difficult to do so, because there is not much leverage. However, and we're going to get to it, when we get to the end, it takes very little energy to force the sword to move. Forte, meaning strong again, is for the defense. You keep that close because that can easily deflect an opponent's foible, which we're getting to, via basic rules of leverage. And my style, as you will find, is built around understanding leverage, understanding simple body mechanics, and behaving in an efficient, easy to comprehend, easy to practice, easy to apply method. Or perhaps more simple method. Hence the name. Now, the middle section is called the mezzoforte, meaning middle strong. This is sort of the sweet spot when you're looking to do a concussive blow. It is also very important to know for understanding that at this point, any leverage you're using is going to match pretty well equal that of your opponent, so it actually breaks down to your raw physical strength, not the blade placement. The end third is called the foible, and as I said before, it is the weakest part of the blade. It takes very little effort because of the leverage to cause the blade to move side to side. This is the offensive portion of a sword normally. Obviously, there are other less standard strikes that can be done with other parts of the weapon, and we will discuss that later. However, for the understanding of the art of the sword and most general use, you're going to use the blade. Or as my students love to say, use the sword as a sword. The next part is the guard. Now, I selected this one because while I prefer a cup hilt, which would bow in like a bowl, this allows visibility of the hand. And for the purpose of filming especially, visibility of the hand isn't needed because you need to see if I change my grip, if I use other methods. So having a more open guard has its advantages. Now, within the guard, you have this little gap. It's called a ricasso. Sometimes it's a false ricasso, meaning it's just a bare part of the blade tang sticking through. Sometimes it's a real ricasso and there's wood wrapped around it. I suppose this would be considered a false ricasso because it is blade material, but it gets a little complicated, so we're just going to call it, that's the ricasso. These two bars running horizontal and bisecting the ricasso are called quillions, and they are used primarily defensively to deflect and bind blades. We'll get into that a little later too, but sometimes you'll hear them called quillons because that's the proper French pronunciation. That hurts my soul and it hurts my speech impediment, so except to expressly mention it, I'm going to call them quillions or simply a crosspiece. Now, the part you grip on a sword, which in this case is wrapped, is called the hilt. The weight at the end is called the pommel. The pommel acts as counterweight to make the overall balance lighter. This becomes very important because you're going to have this weapon in your arms a long time. The grip needs to be comfortable. The balance needs to be comfortable. The point of balance on this, and we're going to stop for a moment to explain, is where if you put your finger, the sword balances is literally right. I can't actually get there because it's right where the guard, let me see if I can get it to do it, right where the guard actually sits. This means, as a weapon, all this weight and all this weight are equal, meaning the ability to move the tip, to manipulate the tip, is very, very fast. Now, in some swords, the point of balance is way out here, and that gives you a much stronger, more aggressive cut, because once you throw a blow, once the strike is coming down, and I'm using terms so that you can get that, the weight is with you. You're not, once you get it going, you're not fighting it. However, to deflect offline, you have to fight that weight. It can make a sword feel heavier and less nimble. For my style, you want a very nimble sword because it is an efficient style, so you shouldn't have to use a lot of strength to get anything done, or else you're not likely to be able to do it. I train like it's my absolute worst physical day. If you train and design a style for that on your best day, it's all very easy. So, going over real quick, we have the blade. The blade is made of 3 parts. The forte, the mezzoforte, and the foible. Now, you honestly need to understand 2, the forte and the foible, because later you're going to defend primarily with the forte and attack with the foible. Very simple. You have a guard. In this case, this black thing is what retains the guard on this particular training weapon. You have quillions, a ricasso. You have a grip. You have a pommel. This sword features something called a knuckle duster. I am rather fond of these because, amongst other things, offensively, they give you an option, but they defend your hand, and I like my hands. I'm an artist, dabbling musician. I don't want my fingers broken, so I prefer that. Now, when we talk about selecting a blade, it can be very challenging because some of us are much taller than others. In my case, you do not want a sword longer than the outstretched tip of your finger to your center line. This is the maximum length of a blade you want. Your sword can continue, but it starts to drag. And we'll talk about that later when we start talking about low-line parries. This weapon is a very good length for me. This is the blade is as long as my arm, so this is as long as perhaps a traditional arming sword would be. That means mechanically, even when I'm in a low guard, which we'll talk later, when I block down, I'm not going to drag the tip of my sword on the ground. You want your weapon to match you. And we're going to talk about making weapons later and purchasing them. But we need to get the understanding. There may be people who want to go out and immediately get a very long weapon. And you have to train with it. But if you want to work with your body, you have to work with your body's proportions. Very often someone who is short wants a longer weapon to compensate, not realizing they may not have the strength to handle the leverage. So it's very important that you make sure your weapon fits your needs, as this one does. I hope this has been educational. This is the first in a many-part series. And I'm also hoping that as we go on, I can improve both production value and content attach to give you the best educational experience I can. Unfortunately, I do everything out of pocket. I don't charge my students. I don't charge pretty much anyone. So I've added a Patreon. If you like what I'm doing and you want me to have the ability to upgrade, my background, upgrade my camera, please consider me, any generous donation. Even the smallest bit will go a long ways. Well, folks, this is almost the end of the video. I want to remind you, the Simple Sword is available on Amazon in both paperback and as an ebook. Also, I will be appearing at ArcticCon in Maryville, Indiana, March 3rd. While I will primarily be there selling my tactics game, Big Snuffy Robots, I will also likely have a few copies of the Simple Sword for anyone who wants to buy it, get it autographed, etc. That's all I have for tonight. Well, thank you, and as always, support your local swordmaster.